Welcome. In this video, we're going to give an introduction to Old Testament ethics. So we'll do three things. First, we'll get a brief overview of the structure of the Old Testament. Then we'll discuss some of the distinctive moral themes in the Old Testament. And finally, we will look at the context for our readings from the Old Testament. I want to start by talking about the direction in which I'm taking this discussion. Our aim in looking at the Old Testament is ultimately to trace a line to contemporary ethics. I've chosen to emphasize this topic because it serves as some of the source for a lot of the later thinking on ethics. So I'm looking at it through that lens. And the line from contemporary ethics to the Old Testament mainly goes through Christianity. So I'm going to look at it in that way. In a sense, I'll be most interested in the things that Aquinas and Luther and Calvin took out of the Old Testament in the Middle Ages, because that in turn influenced what happened with the Enlightenment, which influenced modern ethics. Now, this is a problematic way of approaching history. Now, you may notice I chose to say the Old Testament, and that might raise some red flags. Why? Because by saying the Old Testament, I'm implicitly implying that there's a New Testament. That's why early Christians started calling it the Old Testament to contrast it with the New. Of course, this is very much a Christian perspective, not a Jewish perspective on the Old Testament. So the term is loaded. Now, I use it partly so we keep in mind I'm doing this as preparation for how certain later figures that I'm emphasizing interpreted the text and what they drew from the text and how it influenced them. But that is a very loaded way of looking at it, and you should keep that in mind. And if you find points where it's relevant to our overall concerns about the history of ethics, challenge it, right? Point out, now, wait a minute. You are taking this perspective, basically Christian perspective, that is problematic when we look at the text. Okay. So I want to start by giving an overview of the history given in the Old Testament. The Old Testament does contain a lot of things about how to behave, but it's embedded in a historical narrative. So I'm going to give you an overview of the history recorded in the Old Testament, basically from the perspective of the Old Testament. So let's start with the beginning of the Old Testament, the book of Genesis. In the book of Genesis, God creates the world and the father and mother of all human beings. God makes a covenant with one man, Abraham. That's a special sort of agreement between people. Abraham's grandson, Jacob, later known as Israel, inherits the covenant. And then Jacob's descendants end up in slavery in Egypt. So it's describing the formation of a distinct set of people, the people who are descended from Jacob, and they end up in slavery in Egypt. Now, then we go on to the flight from Egypt. God chooses someone named Moses, one of the descendants of Jacob, to bring the people out of slavery and out of Egypt. And they go out into the wilderness. They're heading east towards what's modern Israel-Palestine. While they're out in the wilderness, God gives Moses the law, and the people make God angry. So they end up having to wander around for 40 years, which many people say means a long time. It's basically until the generation that made God angry dies out, so the next generation gets to go to the land that they're supposed to get. And so they go to what's called the Promised Land, right, which is a land that God's supposed to be giving them to live in, and they mostly conquer it. I say mostly, there's some places in the margin that they don't get to. Now, then we have the Davidic kingdom. They start out, when they enter the Promised Land, with a very decentralized political system. It's basically a patriarchal system governed by a traditional law with no centralized authority for enforcing the law, just sporadic points of leadership from different places. They come up to either defend the people against external enemies or punish violations of the law. But it's very decentralized. And the people don't like this, partly because they're getting beat up by their neighbors. And so they go to a man named Samuel, who's supposed to speak for God, and they say, "We want a king." And God basically says, well, this is a really bad idea. It's going to be bad for them, but they've asked for it. I'm going to give it to them. And they get kings. So as a united people, they have 4 kings: Saul, David, Solomon, and Rehoboam. Now, Solomon significantly builds the temple in Jerusalem, which is a focal point for the religious worship of this people. Now, Rehoboam, Solomon's son, provokes a revolt. So he does something that angers a large number of people, and basically it splits into 2 kingdoms. So the one kingdom splits into 2. And these 2 kingdoms are known as Judah and Israel. Israel's in the north, sometimes called the northern kingdom. Judah is in the south. There's periods of decline and recovery. It's a long, complicated story. And it ends with, first, the Assyrians coming in and taking over Israel and deporting a large number of people. And then later, the Babylonians take over Judah and deport a large number of people. The Babylonians also destroy Solomon's temple. So now we have the Babylonian exile. A large number of people are forcibly resettled in Babylon or other parts of the Babylonian Empire. And a large part of the Promised Land becomes a wasteland. Eventually, there's a king, the king of the Persians, Cyrus, gets in charge. There's various empires conquer each other. Cyrus the Persian comes into power, and he allows a large number of people to return and rebuild. And they build a second temple on the site of the first. And that's pretty much where the Old Testament, as we have it, stops. Or at least, well, I'll leave it there, where the Old Testament stops. So that's the basic history recounted in the Old Testament and the historical background. Now, we can divide the Old Testament into 3 parts. As I understand it, Judaism typically divides what it calls the Tanakh into 3 parts: the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. Right? Christians have different ways of dividing it up. The Torah tells the history of Israel from the creation of the world up to the death of Moses. It also gives the law. The prophets tell more of the history of Judah and Israel, and they also contain the writings of a series of prophets. So a prophet is someone who speaks on behalf of God. So God gives messages to the prophets to give to various people. Sometimes they predict the future, but often what they do is simply say what God has to say about situations going on then. It often means accusing people of doing something wrong. So, some themes in the prophets. They nearly always accuse the people and or the leaders of betraying God in some way by their behavior, so accusations against people's behavior. And they usually, but not always, give some message of hope. And then there are the writings, and these contain a variety of texts. It contains Psalms, which is a long book of songs, religious songs. It contains Proverbs, which is a huge collection of short sayings. There's a lot of other things. And I should add, I went with the Tanakh, which is basically the set of books that is shared by Judaism and Protestantism. The Roman Catholic Church accepts some additional books, and the Eastern Orthodox Church accepts those and a few more. Right? So typically what you'll get if you buy a Bible in the United States is basically the United States is historically Protestant, and so you'll get 39 books that constitute the Protestant Old Testament. If you can find a Roman Catholic Bible, it will have more, and an Eastern Orthodox Bible will have a little more. Now, let me go into some specifics. Let's start with the law. The Torah presents a large number of rules. Now, in our modern terms, these tend to fall into religious ceremonial, legal social, and personal morality. So, for example, religious ceremonial laws. It gives the laws about how a person is supposed to behave on Saturday, which is the Sabbath. It's a day that's supposed to be a day of rest every week. Okay. It explains the types of animal sacrifices you would make on different occasions. For example, if you're trying to express gratitude to God for something, it's done in one way. If you committed a serious wrongdoing, you give a different type of sacrifice, etc. So the religious and ceremonial side of life. There's also what we might call legal social rules, things like the rules about property, the rules about theft, some rules about caring for the poor, marriage laws, and others. Then there is personal morality. Right? For example, there's a lot of things that we would consider personal matters today about regulating sexuality and some other things. Now, one thing about the law, these seem to be at the same time rules and case studies. So, as far as I know, they were generally meant to be strictly followed, but they're not meant to be exhaustive. Right? Let me give an example. I believe you're going to read a short passage where it says that if you lend someone money and you ask them to give you something to ensure that they're going to pay you back, you can't take the person's millstone. Now, a millstone was something used to grind grain. Now, the millstone was basically someone's livelihood, right? And it's very explicit. You can't take the thing that a person needs to make their living away from them as their promise to pay you back for a debt. Now, that doesn't mean that you can say, well, you can't take away someone's millstone, but hey, if it's a tailor, you can take all his needle and cloth and threads, okay? That's not what it's saying. So a lot of the laws are supposed to have larger implications, and Jews and Christians work those out in different ways. Now, the prophets. The prophets tend to focus on areas where people are failing, and often that is failing to meet up to the terms of the laws, but sometimes other things as well, right? Or rather, I might say, sometimes further things that are implied by the law. Now, they talk a lot about mistreatment of the poor, widows, and orphans. So mistreatment of people who can't economically support themselves is a major theme. One of the reasons for this has to do with the time period. The prophets are writing in a time when there's been an enormous growth in wealth for the nation or for both kingdoms, and a lot of urbanization, which creates some economic problems that weren't necessarily there in the beginning. Now, in terms of moral theory or metaethics, there's not a lot of abstract speculation about the meaning of morality in the Old Testament. On a practical level, knowledge of morality is connected to God. There's a famous line in the book of Proverbs, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom." The Lord is a traditional name for God. And it tends to give three reasons for behaving morally. Immoral behavior tends to harm the immoral person. Immoral behavior betrays God. And immoral behavior is bad in itself. I also want to talk about some points of later influence. These are things I want you to pay special attention to. The first has to do with moral law. The Old Testament ties together religion and morality in a way that the Greeks or the Romans would not have done before they were influenced by Judaism and Christianity. So for the ancient Greeks, religion was primarily a civil matter. It was part of your civic duties. It was part of the civic life, the life of the city. Morality would have come from family custom law, from other sources. But the Old Testament ties religion and morality together very closely. And that, of course, is going to be picked up by Christianity. And the Old Testament brings in the idea of divine law, a law given by God to humanity. And those are going to be very important in the coming millennia. There's also an emphasis on human dignity in the Old Testament. First, the Old Testament insists on a common origin for every human being. So as some critics have pointed out, the Egyptians would have agreed that Pharaoh had some kind of divine origin, but they wouldn't have thought that peasants and slaves had divine origin. The Old Testament insists it's not just the rulers. Every human being, male and female, traces back to a pair of ancestors who were made by God in the image of God. It also sets up a political system that basically makes all adult males equal. Everyone is assigned every family is given a certain amount of land. Okay, so there's a certain amount of equality between adult males. Now, it is a highly patriarchal society. Okay, so the father has a very strong authority. But at the same time, it gives a certain amount of rights and dignity to women that you might not have found in other societies of the time. Now, one point to remember as you read this. When you read ancient ethics, I always think it's important to remember that these are laws for life in a very harsh world. Here's an example I often use. If you or I want a glass of water, chances are what we do is take a glass, go over to the sink, turn on a faucet, and we get fresh, clean water. If someone in this time period wanted water, somebody had to take a bucket and go to the river or the well to get water. So now I realize that some people who take this class grew up with economic disadvantages, right? I recognize that. But for most of us, it was nothing compared to what they had to deal with routinely in the ancient world. Okay? We have a lot of technology that they simply didn't have in those times. Okay? And so there was a lot less leeway for mistakes. You were closer to starvation in that world than most people, if not all people in North America are today. Now, with that in mind, let me look at a couple of the readings, particularly Exodus and Deuteronomy. Exodus and Deuteronomy are part of the Torah. These books present the law as part of a larger narrative. So they're telling this story about what happens basically from the time they were in slavery in Egypt to arriving in the Promised Land. And in these stories, God gives the law to Moses during the 40 years in the wilderness. There are two things in particular that I want you to look for. Look for passages that affirm human dignity and passages that seem to endorse inequality. Also, look closely at the reasons that it gives for obeying the law in general or specific laws. Now, there's also a reading from the book of Isaiah. Isaiah was a prophet who prophesied in Judah before the Babylonian exile. There's at least the portions you're reading are definitely before the Babylonian exile. There are two things in particular that I want you to look for. First, what does it say about the nature of morality and or reasons to be moral? And what picture does it give of an ideal society? Okay. It's presenting a picture of an ideal society that will come in the future, right? After a lot of bad things happen. So what is that picture? Okay, so bottom line, the Old Testament describes the history of a particular people. The Old Testament gives a large amount of ethical instruction. It seems to offer several different reasons for why we should be moral. And it's a major source for our ideas about moral law and human dignity.